Bienvenue dans...
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 73 of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, March 7th, 2023, the committee is meeting to discuss its study on adapting infrastructure to face climate change. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuant to the House Order of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. Members can attend in person in the room or remotely using Zoom.
I wish to inform the committee members that all witnesses have been tested for sound quality for the benefit of our interpreters and have passed the sound test. Colleagues appearing before us today as witnesses, we have from the Canadian Climate Institute, Mr. Ryan Ness, Director Adaptation by video conference. We have from the Canadian Urban Transit Association, Ralph Nielsen, Director Enterprise Sustainability by video conference. We have from Horizons Group, Wing-Ong Lee, Director and Chief Executive Officer by video conference. Welcome. On a de la MRC de Vaudreuil.
From the MRC of Vaudreuil-Soulanges, Mr. Patrick Boussez, Prefect. Welcome to the meeting. From the Municipality of the Magdalen Islands, we have Mr. Antonin Valiquette, the Mayor. Welcome.
Et de la ville de Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu.
And from the city of Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and André Bouchard, Mayor. Welcome to all of you.
Begin our opening remarks today with Mr. Ness from the Canadian Climate Institute. Mr. Ness, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the invitation to speak today. My name is Ryan Ness, and I'm the Director of Adaptation at the Canadian Climate Institute, Canada's independent climate policy research organization. Our job is to generate research and advice for decision makers to make informed policy decisions and to drive action that's proportional to Canada's climate change challenges. We've examined the potential impacts and costs of climate change on Canada's infrastructure, as well as the benefits of infrastructure adaptation, as part of our Costs of Climate Change for Canada research series, the largest study to date of the potential economic implications of climate change for this country. Today, I'll highlight some key findings and recommendations that are relevant to the work of this committee. The first key finding is that the costs to Canada of damage and disruption from climate change to infrastructure, which is already vulnerable from decades of underinvestment, could be massive. Climate change-driven damage to roads and electricity systems from hotter summers alone could cost another $2.5 to $4 billion annually by 2050. Flood damage to homes and buildings could triple from over $1 billion now to over $5 billion per year by 2050 as well. And this damage costs everybody, not just those directly affected, but all, by disrupting economic growth. We estimate by 2025, just the additional impacts of climate change since 2015 will cost the Canadian economy $25 billion in GDP and reduce average household incomes by $800. And the impacts of climate change on infrastructure will have major non-economic costs as well, fundamentally changing ways of life in some parts of Canada, such as in the north, where many communities that are built on thawing permafrost and that rely on increasingly unviable winter roads could become unlivable in just 1 or 2 decades. The second key finding is that proactive investment in infrastructure adaptation is by far the most cost-effective way to protect the infrastructure services that people, businesses, and the economy depend on. When repaving roads, for example, using materials selected to withstand the climate 2 or 3 decades into the future can reduce climate change costs by over 90%. Protecting or moving neighborhoods and buildings in high-risk areas could reduce the cost of coastal flooding by up to $1 billion every year by the end of the century. We find that as a whole, each dollar invested in adaptation can return $5 in avoided damage to directly affected households, businesses, and governments, as well as an additional $10 in avoided disruption to the Canadian economy. A third key finding is that a lack of information and guidance are holding back progress in Canada on infrastructure adaptation and resilience. For example, approximately 500,000 buildings at risk of flooding in Canada are not identified on any government-produced flood maps, and mapping of wildfire risk is virtually non-existent. In the absence of this information, few infrastructure owners or investors are able to assess and manage existing climate risks, let alone future risks that would be associated with climate change. Many codes and standards that dictate how infrastructure in Canada is built still don't account for climate change, and others that are in the process of being updated are many years away from being implemented. And financial regulation is currently doing very little to ensure that infrastructure owners and investors are pricing climate risk into infrastructure investment decisions. So recommendations that emerge from these findings relevant to the work of this committee First, that the Government of Canada should play a leadership role in ensuring that all government spending and regulatory decisions around infrastructure explicitly take into account climate risks and adaptation benefits. Federal government actions such as the expanded financial support for municipal infrastructure adaptation under the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund and Green Municipal Fund, as well as other work like research on codes and standards, are important, but are not delivering results at the scale and at the pace that is required. The federal government should lead long-term coordinated and accelerated approaches to make better use of the collective resources and powers of all orders of government to ensure that new infrastructure is built to be resilient and that existing infrastructure is made resilient. Second, the Government of Canada should do more to lead and coordinate the development and publication of accurate information about climate-related infrastructure risks across the country. Investments to this end announced in the National Infrastructure Strategy and in Budget 2023 around flood mapping are a positive step, but these provide only a small fraction of the funding that will be required to develop complete coast-to-coast-to-coast climate risk information and mapping. And third and last, governments and regulators should be requiring climate change risks to be made transparent in infrastructure transactions, whether it be homeowners putting houses up for sale or municipalities issuing bonds. The Government of Canada and the regulatory bodies that it oversees can again lead here by demonstrating for other governments and regulators how policies and tools can be developed to ensure that owners, lenders, investors, and other financial system actors are analyzing, disclosing, and managing climate risk associated with infrastructure investment and driving capital towards less risky infrastructure decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ness. Next, we have Mr. Nielsen. Mr. Nielsen, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the committee. I'm representing the Canadian Urban Transit Association, but my day job is the Director of Enterprise Sustainability at TransLink, and I'm responsible for developing and leading the climate action plan and strategy for our organization. TransLink is North America's first multimodal transportation authority, enacted by provincial legislation in 1998. And we serve a region of 2.5 million people that's going to grow to 3.5 million people by 2050. This region encompasses 21 municipalities, 9 First Nations, 1 Treaty Nation, and 1 electoral district. But we're not just about transit. We own and operate 6 bridges in the region, and we provide operations and maintenance funding for the major road network and invest in cycling and walking infrastructure together with our regional partners. Climate change is directly affecting our region. In 2021, as you know, our population was directly affected by significant events that have been directly linked to climate change. During the summer of that year, 619 people died across British Columbia during the successive heat waves and the heat dome. Then later, October, November that year, the region was effectively physically and economically cut off from the rest of Canada due to successive atmospheric rivers and the flooding and the bridge takeouts that ensued. Climate change is also affecting TransLink and transit infrastructure. Our work on an adaptation strategy and plan told us that water, essentially flooding, intense rain and sea level rise is going to affect infrastructure, and heat affects people. We know that several of our bus depots, which we use to deploy our fleet in the region, are located on floodplains, some of which are very well protected while others are not, and will become essentially islands, unable to deliver services during a critical flood event along the Fraser River. We also know that heat is affecting our staff. We've had to shorten some shifts, provide temporary cooling and extra PPE, and make accommodations for staff working in facilities that were designed 30 years ago without air conditioning. And we also know that heat is going to affect our customers. Whether they take transit, walk, or bike, it's really important that we keep them comfortable and safe, and ensuring that they continue to choose TransLink and transit over taking the automobile. Adaptation is key to managing our long-term risks, physical or financial, to transit. Our government institutions, our financial institutions, our regional partners, and the Government of Canada that serve and fund transit in Canada are expecting us to have mitigation and adaptation plans and the associated disclosure of those risks. We are grateful for federal investments via the Zero Emission Transit Fund to address climate change mitigation through our fleet transitions, but our long-term success in climate change adaptation is dependent upon 3 things. Number 1, close collaboration, proactive planning, and design between climate change adaptation specialists, engineers, architects, emergency management and preparedness experts, but as well as the building codes, as Mr. Ness mentioned, are really important for planning and designing to higher standards based on the future climate rather than historical norms. Second, we need consistent, reliable funding, primarily for key things: regional cross infrastructure or cross jurisdictional protection against severe events. And that is, for example, the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy, which requires collaboration across the entire region. Second, the premium for designing and constructing new infrastructure that can adapt to the changing climate over the typically 50 to 70-year life cycle that we design and build our infrastructure for. I think the Permanent Transit Fund would be an excellent means of delivering the support to enable transit agencies to manage these long-term risks. And finally, programs that keep our customers safe, comfortable, either it's active or passive cooling strategies or tree canopies that continue to make transit, walking, and cycling a preferred choice that's reliable, convenient, and frequent over the automobile. Next, we need to protect and enhance our natural assets that can oftentimes be our best protection against severe events, but also sequester carbon, improve biodiversity, and bring nature back into the suburban or urban landscape. But we need to do this work in a couple of different ways than in the past. One is equity. Our solutions have to be equitable, just, and do no further disadvantage to equity-seeking groups, those with lower incomes. Can't the planting of trees go alongside zero emissions transit in these neighborhoods? And then second, two-eyed seeing. Acknowledging Indigenous and Western knowledge systems both can help us find long-term adaptation solutions that we may otherwise not see or discover on our own. Finally, I'd like to thank the Canadian Urban Transit Association and the BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure for knowledge sharing between us and the other agencies, and we hope that TransLink's leadership in climate change adaptation will help other agencies across Canada. I look forward to the discussions this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nielsen. Next, we have Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, sir. Apologies, Mr. Lee. I believe you're on mute before you go any further.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and honorable members. My name is Wing Lee, CEO of the Windsor-based property developer Horizons Group. We are an eco-friendly developer in the Windsor-Essex County market, building sustainable homes at attainable prices. Today, Canada has about 40 million people living in 15 million homes. Our homes contribute 17% towards the nation's total greenhouse gas emissions. By 2050, the population will probably be double if we continue to welcome overseas immigrants at current rates. To achieve the federal government's 2050 net zero vision, we must keep the carbon footprint of future homes as low as possible, while we encourage existing homeowners to slash their household energy consumption with retrofit improvements. Over the past 20 years, attempts were made to induce people to buy energy-efficient homes accredited by Energy Star, Energy, or R2000. Unfortunately, there has been little success, mainly because of the higher price tag that deter both builders and buyers from making an environmentally sound decision. To ensure we can weather the global warming challenge, governments at federal, provincial, and municipal levels, developers, homeowners, and investors, all stakeholders, must come up with a viable business model that could help all the stakeholders to pay a fair share of financial contributions that could eventually benefit themselves in the long run. That's what we call a win-win-win strategy to face climate change challenge. Horizons Group has a corporate vision of producing energy-efficient homes like the net zero homes that Natural Resources Canada has been advocating. By definition, net zero homes are 80% more energy efficient than those built under the current building codes. To be more specific, the most important feature is that these homes use renewable energy to cover all or most of what they consume. In other words, their utility bills are always kept low, say $30 to $50, per month all year round. So our group does not mind being a first mover. We always walk the talk. Last October, we announced that we are going to market 52 net zero homes in Colchester in the town of Essex, which MP Chris Lewis represents. These homes feature geothermal and solar energy generation system at the property. We have ICF walls and airtight envelope plus a metal roof. And finally, we'll install a level 2 EV charger in the garage to encourage residents to switch to electrical vehicles. In sum, we are creating a subdivision that would not put a burden on the town's power infrastructure. As a matter of fact, the engineer at Hydro One is amazed by what we told her when she asked us about, hey, how much power demand to plan for your new subdivision? I said, very little. So we are finalizing the building costs for each homes. The extra costs for the eco-friendly features are almost 20% of the total construction budget. While realtors and buyers love our eco homes and the long-term benefits, they don't like the higher prices paid upfront. As a good corporate citizen, we don't mind lowering our profit margin for a lofty social cost. However, we cannot price the homes beyond the prospective buyer's affordability or purchasing power. This is where government at different tiers must step in to make net zero homes a real option for them. They must offer incentive to the builders and the homeowners. The federal government has announced in the last budget up to 30% investment tax credit for geothermal initiatives to be taken by new homeowners or builders. No details were announced yet, but I think this is a giant step in the right direction. At the provincial level, we recommend the government waiving the land transfer tax for the buyers of the accredited net zero homes. At the municipal level, a city or town can choose to waive the builder's development charges or permit application fees so that we can keep our home prices low. The best initiative, I think the best incentive is to give the owners a tax credit in the home's property bills. So this combined government efforts will be a critical success factor in determining the destiny of net zero homes. Another positive development in the financing of green structure is the participation of institutional money in renewable energy assets, such as those we are investing in Colchester. Private investors have approached us and they said that we are willing to pay you a buyout allowance for the geothermal and solar energy system, the assets, in return for a 25 years energy as a service contract with the homeowners to recoup the investment and make a profit. So if the monthly energy service fee are lower than those otherwise normal utility bills, owners, we believe, would gladly accept the offer because they will then enjoy unlimited renewable energy without worrying about the escalating utility costs and the maintenance expenses in the next 25 years.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, I'm going to have to ask you, unfortunately, to wrap up. If you're close to finishing, I'll let you finish, sir.
Yeah, to recap, we are confident in that the net zero homes are an attainable home product with a premium if the governments and all the builders and home buyers all work together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee, for your opening remarks. The bells are ringing, colleagues, so I'm just looking around and ask for unanimous consent, perhaps to at least finish. And after we have the 3 remaining opening remarks, it'll be 15 minutes. Are we all in agreement? Perfect. Thank you very much. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur.
Next, we have Patrick Boussez. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I want to thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to be able to contribute to this study and to share the experiences of Vaudreuil-Soulanges in the face of growing climate threats. Now, Mr. Chair, you know the region well. We know each other. But for the other members of the committee, I would like to tell you a little bit about my region to give you a bit of context for what I'm going to say later. So the territory of Vaudreuil-Soulanges brings together 23 municipalities over 850 square kilometers. In 2022, we had over 166,000 people living there, and the demographics are constantly growing. We have a number of important highways, the A30, the A20, and the Trans-Canada, in addition to major rail lines, CN and CP rail lines running through the territory, And we also have 5 pipelines running through the area, which pose a certain risk. Vaudreuil-Soulanges is both metropolitan and rural, and has an agricultural territory that represents 76% of the land. We're facing the consequences of climate change, and increasingly we're dealing with intense weather events like the ice storm of last April. Everyone would remember the ice storm of 1998. And, well, the one that we had just last April is actually the second largest ice storm in the history of Quebec. Vaudreuil-Soulanges was one of the first areas touched by the freezing rain, and 97% of our population ended up without electricity for a long period of time, in some cases up to 6 days. Given the extraordinary circumstances and the scope of the damage, the municipality faced a number of challenges. Of course, we can never be fully prepared for natural catastrophes, and there's always room for improvement. And when a situation like this arises, the first thing that we always try to do is to establish communication with all the key players in the area to make sure that everything is in place to be able to meet people's needs quickly. But despite the fact that we're in this modern communications era, we quickly realized that we were not able to establish communication because telecommunications networks were either partly or completely out of service for a number of hours, and in some cases a number of days. As a result, we weren't even able to reach out to other elected officials like MPs and other mayors, and it was a lot more complicated to maintain communication than it normally would have been. Now, because most people have cell phones rather than landlines, we didn't have any backup way to reach people. So instead of trying to communicate by telephone, people actually had to go door to door to make sure that they reached people who were vulnerable. That was a lot slower. There were some people who did have access to social networks online, but of course that was not everyone. So to give you an idea of the scope of this crisis, I'll give you some numbers. There was 30 to 35 millimeters of freezing rain that fell in 13 hours. In some areas, it was over 40 millimeters, according to Environment Canada. In Vaudreuil-Soulanges, over 64,000 Hydro-Quebec customers out of 75,000 experienced a lack of electricity. Essential services were closed, like gas stations, and they were unable to meet demand. As a result, there were waiting lineups of sometimes several kilometers long. Sometimes 2 to 3 hours was the time that people had to wait to get a generator or to fill up on gas. Now, in some cases, generators are used to pump water out of flooded basements. And they also ensure that heating systems can work and that cell phones can be plugged in so that communication can happen. So municipalities tried to direct people to relevant resources. The 911 services in Lévis never received so many calls in such a short period of time. In 2022, throughout the year, there were just over 3,000 calls to 911 for fires or emergencies. But between April 4th and 9th of 2023, there were over 2,000 calls in only 6 days. So that's 71% of 911 calls received for the entire year 2022. Now, calling 911 isn't just calling a single number. There are a number of different groups that come together. It's also important to know that fire response and other radio communication passes through those lines. During the ice storm, the telecommunications network wasn't working properly, and there was a very significant increase in radio communication traffic. Even the Sûreté du Québec, Quebec's police force, didn't have proper cell coverage. so you can understand how this was a disaster when it comes to essential services. So civil measures, infrastructure, and essential services were all put to the test during the ice storm. This experience shows that we're going to need more help from governments in order to help adapt our infrastructure to increasingly variable climate events. We will need to make sure that our telecommunications network is more robust so that we can face these climate challenges, because it's clear that we're going to be confronted with climate challenges more and more. I'd like to conclude by just mentioning how resilient a lot of these municipalities were and how they worked to find solutions to improve telecommunications, electricity, and municipal infrastructure networks. I would also invite stakeholders to work on other measures to improve the situation. Thank you for listening, and I hope that your committee will be able to continue to help identify and implement solutions quickly, given how important this issue is. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Bousses. Next, we have Mr. Valiquette. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please. I believe you're on mute. There you go. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having invited me to appear before the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities as part of your study on adapting infrastructure to climate change. I'm happy to speak to you as the mayor and as the president of the maritime community of the Magdalen Islands, which is made up of 2 different islands. And the archipelago has 13,000 regular residents, and we also get about 75,000 tourists every year who stay for an average of 11 days. To simplify things and to avoid confusion, I'm going to be referring to the municipality, but when I use the word municipality, I am referring to all of the people that I represent on both of those islands. To give you some context, the Magdalen Islands are at the center of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, more than 100 kilometers from the nearest landmass. So we're really at the front lines of climate change. Shoreline erosion is something that we're very familiar with, but since the more recent storms, we've also been dealing with coastal submersion. Up until recently, we often experienced strong wind and rainstorms that attacked our coasts, and we were really pioneers in Quebec in terms of collecting scientific data and doing cost-benefit analysis to deal with shoreline erosion. And despite all those storms, the last real hurricane that we had dealt with was actually Hurricane Blanche in 1974. But with the storm in November 2018, Dorian in 2019, and Fiona in 2022, it's now clear that we're in a new era where Mother Nature's attacks are much stronger and more intense. These weather events, in addition to ice cover in the winter, have left us vulnerable. So we need to take action to protect our infrastructure and make difficult choices when it comes to managing the territory. The main infrastructure owned by the Government of Canada are port infrastructure in the Magdalen Islands. We have 8 small craft harbors owned by DFO. That includes 325 lobster vessels and another 50 coastal fishing boats. This represents about $250 million in benefits for community. For the small craft harbor, we are satisfied with the role that DFO is playing. They are trying to anticipate the role of climate change for the next 40 or 50 years. Unfortunately, things are accelerating, and there's an acceleration of silting in some of the ports, and that's putting a strain on the budget. Despite the effort and the sums invested in these harbors, it's clear that more funding will be needed in order to accelerate work to be able to face the consequences of climate change. Major intervention in a fishing port is also an opportunity for us to intervene on the broader territory and to optimize things. However, there's a lack of alignment between funding for ports specifically and other funding. The archipelago also has a commercial port under the responsibility of Transport Canada, which is home to the ferry that links us to Prince Edward Island, the cargo ship that supplies us with merchandise from Montreal, tankers and barges that supply us with fuel, and fuel for various infrastructure projects. The fleet of midshore fishing boats and the cruise ships that visit us in ever-increasing numbers are also there. It's our community's vital link with the rest of the world. Commercial wharf number 1, used mainly for barge unloading, is aging and it's ill-suited to today's intensive use. With climate change, we will need to upgrade that infrastructure and, above all, provide a backup infrastructure to compensate in the event that wharf number 1 were to break down. All material needed to combat climate change transits through this wharf. The commercial port of Cap-aux-Meules is a vital infrastructure that's been neglected for decades. So we're trying to catch up, and the Premier announced significant sums in 2022. We think that we're on the right track, but unfortunately we're not really sure how enthusiastic we should be about improving infrastructure under Transport Canada's management. Since 2008, millions have been invested by the Municipalité des Îles and the provincial and federal governments to work on coastal protection and shoreline stabilization. This represents a significant tax burden for a relatively small municipality with only 13,000 inhabitants. The municipality is currently working on an intervention framework to deal with shoreline erosion that will find solutions to protect the shoreline and assess costs. We would like to be able to prevent problems rather than simply react to them. Studies available show that every dollar invested in prevention allows us to save between $13 and $15 in remediating damages. We consider it important that all three levels of government work together to implement this framework. This will allow us to optimize every dollar invested. For municipalities like ours to be able to effectively adapt infrastructure to climate change, they need to be able to have predictability so that they can inform their populations, choose the right solutions, decide what steps need to be taken on the ground, and really assess the impact of that work. They need to be able to have flexibility as well, so that they can modify and change their priorities if new events come up, without having to have a really long process or having to meet different criteria. When he appeared before the committee on May 4th, Matt Gamble from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities said that, in his opinion, the cost of replacing or updating municipal assets alone would be about $175 billion. Those are immense sums, and so it's important to make sure that we can succeed. In conclusion, our community and its organizations have been proactive for a long time, and we are committed to adapting to climate change and protecting the Magdalen Islands. To do so, we will need significant financial support and predictable financial support, as well as a flexible regulatory environment. We're counting on your support. In conclusion, we found that it's difficult to reconcile the programs of the Government of Canada with those of the Government of Quebec. In practice, this can result in delays or limitations in the ways that we can use the funding that's available. So we would certainly ask you to do whatever you can to ensure greater fluidity there. That will benefit all of our population. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Valiquette. Finally, we have Ms. Bouchard. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Let me just get my microphone turned on. Mr. Chair, committee members, thank you for inviting me on this day following World Environment Day in order to discuss infrastructure and how we can adapt infrastructure to climate change. My name is André Bouchard. I'm the mayor of Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, which in December of 2022 became the 11th municipality in Quebec to pass the 100,000 mark in terms of population. Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu has more than 350 years of history, And with that history comes the challenge of aging infrastructure. We still have 90 kilometers of combined infrastructure that needs to be dealt with between now and 2028. In the spring of 2011, Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, along with other municipalities along the Richelieu and Lac Champlain rivers, experienced the worst flooding on record. This left an indelible mark on the people of Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and the municipal authorities who worked very hard to manage this big crisis. I would like to say again how grateful we are 12 years later for the support of the community, of the provincial government, the federal government, the army, and the employees of different municipal departments who worked tirelessly to get us through that extremely difficult situation. More than 1,600 homes had to be evacuated, 2,500 homes were damaged, and many businesses and farms were also severely affected. Across the entire flood zone, it's estimated that over 100 bridges and roads were damaged. The International Task Force formed to study the floods assessed the cost at over $188 million Canadian, including almost $150 million worth of damage in Quebec, primarily in the Montérégie region. I would invite you to read the report from the International Joint Commission on the Richelieu River and the Lac Champlain Basin, which makes a number of recommendations that so far have gone unheeded. I sent the link to that report to the clerk just a few minutes ago. Since that time, we in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu have been attempting to take on many environmental initiatives. For example, the climate-friendly municipality set up with, we've also set up an ambitious conservation plan. Our city is a pioneer in the protection of natural environments with major acquisition strategy worth $62 million over the last 10 years. And that strategy will be enhanced starting in 2024. We have a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and another plan to adapt to climate change. We have a tree policy implemented in 2022, including an objective to plant 50,000 trees in 10 years. We have a new responsible procurement policy. Since 2010, we've had a partnership with the Cégep in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu to offer free bus transportation for students. And we've also made transportation free for important public events and holidays. We've created natural parks to promote and provide access to nature. Now, over the next few years, it will be of paramount importance that we're able to get the federal government's support so that municipalities can fund the acquisition of remaining natural environments that are essentially the lungs of the environment, or rather the urban environments that we live in. As elected officials, we need to do everything we can to manage to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because this is intimately linked to climate change, and it's responsible for natural disasters, which are becoming more and more frequent. All levels of government, as well as businesses, organizations, and citizens, must work together collectively for the environment. The question is not if a crisis will affect Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu again, or the other riverside municipalities nearby. The question is when it will happen again. We need to be ready, and we need to make our environment more resilient to climate change. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your attention.
Merci à vous.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
This is a message to all of our witnesses appearing online and in person. A vote has been called in the House of Commons, which requires us to attend to. It shouldn't be more than 15 to 20 minutes, but we do have to suspend the meeting in the meantime. So I ask for your patience, and we will suspend now. You can shut your cameras off, witnesses, and your microphones, and we'll resume probably in about 15, 20 minutes. This meeting is now suspended. again to our witnesses for your patience. We'll begin our line of questioning today with Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses for coming here today and giving your very important testimony to this committee. My first question is for Mr. Lee. Now, Mr. Lee, you spoke extensively about the project that you're working on. I believe you said it was in Essex. And I'm concerned about whether or not you see any tensions between that project, the one that you're building with the eco-friendly environmental sustainability homes, and the cost of building these homes. Because I know that you're predicting long-term savings, but right now the market is such that people can't even afford to get into the market because they don't have the tens of thousands of dollars handy in their bank accounts to make down payments. And you spoke about some really novel things that are being incorporated into your building structure, like geothermal, electric charge plugs in the front of the house, and making them more renewable energy homes. So I'm wondering, how do you reconcile this this notion of potentially people seeing these upfront costs, and is there any way to still encourage people to invest in these homes, knowing that there may be upfront costs, but they will save on the back end through their electricity bills?
Thank you, thank you, MP Vito. I'm happy to answer this question. Yes, indeed, there's a big conflict between the price and the benefits that our eco homes are bringing to the buyers. And I believe that while the costs of these eco features are costly, but I think we have been able to try to do the project with a economy of scale, so that when we talk to the geothermal guys, the solar panel renters, we try to convince them we are not building one house at a time, but we are building a whole subdivision, so we can keep a bulk discount for all the infrastructure. And I think to answer the question that about attainability, so knowing that the prices are more expensive and people may not be able to even put down the down payment. So in our house, in the design of the property, we have also included an additional dwelling unit on the in a property. In Windsor, in Essex, we have a very popular design type called the raised ranch. So basically, it's a bungalow with about the basement not complete underground, but half of them are up above grade. So we have designed with an ADU. It's basically for the rental purpose, so that the owner can now, instead of having just one home for themselves, they have included an additional dwelling unit, which can now rent it to people in the area or their family members, so that the rental income can subsidize, for the mortgage payment every month. And in addition, because they have saved substantial savings in the electric, the hydro bills, so the mortgage lenders will take that into consideration. So it actually adds up so that they can help them to get a loan more easily than the ordinary houses a lot of people are buying right now.
And so you've explained what your company is doing and the foresight that you've put into making sure that people can afford their homes. What do you believe, what steps can government focus on to make it easier for people to purchase these net zero homes and perhaps even move to these areas? One, in building more of these homes. Two, building more of these resilient homes. And three, paying the upfront costs. What do you believe the role of government is in doing this? Because you've stated clearly about how your company has dealt with this issue and thought about it. But is there anything that governments can do?
I believe there's a lot the government could help. As I said in my opening speech, there are several areas that each level of government can participate. And I think the federal government has already taken a very good step by announcing in the current budget the initiative for the owners of these geothermal exchanges and the ductings and the heat pumps and so on. I think the owners can get around up to 30% of the tax credit. So that is a very good move already. And at the provincial level, I think the easiest way is to provide the land transfer tax exemption, so that anybody who buy a eco home with this kind of eco features, so they can entitle for this exemption of the land transfer tax, which saves them a couple of $1,000. And I think the most important part is for the municipal level. I mean, if they can exempt builder like us the development charges, then it will help us a lot, to lower the cost to the barest minimum. And I think if people can also give them an added incentive of enjoying a discount in their tax bill in the long run. So if they say they pay $3,000 annually, but if you are buying an eco home, you can get a 10% discount off your tax bill. I think this would be very useful in incentive, and which I think everybody is paying their fair share, is chipping in to help to lower the upfront costs for the builders, and at the same time we convince the buyers that you can pay a little bit more now, but you reap all the benefits later on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee, and thank you, Dr. Lewis. Next, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to concentrate on the how to the what. And I'm going to concentrate my questions to Mr. Ness. Mr. Ness, I really appreciated your opening comments, in particular how strategic you were thinking and are thinking. And I guess I'm going to concentrate on your vision and how do you envision a whole-of-government approach at and within the federal level of government, between all the departments that are involved in a lot of the programs that would actually attach to climate resiliency infrastructure, and including all levels of government as well, whether it be municipal, regional, county, provincial, territorial, to work together toward integrating capital planning to ensure strategic investments, where's first, toward infrastructure resiliency. 2 points I'd like you to comment on. One is planning and strengthening sustainable funding envelopes available from all levels of government to leverage and partner through all levels of government capital programs available at those levels of government. Secondly is to promote a disciplined approach to land use planning. You spoke a bit on that. Strategic capital investments, as well as asset management plans that are sustainable well into the future through those very funding envelopes that I spoke about earlier. Mr. Ness, can you comment on that, please?
Certainly, and thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, we've heard from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and many other individual municipalities across the country that part of what constrains their ability to build resilient infrastructure and make their existing infrastructure resilient is a lack of stable funding and mechanisms to generate that funding. So certainly, the scale of infrastructure adaptation that's going to be required in this country needs much more funding, needs many more financial resources than what is available right now. And so that's going to require innovative solutions, both in terms of maximizing the utility of public finances, as well as potentially looking for more creative ways to bring in private financing as well. To your second point, certainly municipal asset management, long-term capital planning, those are certainly and have been highlighted by the municipal community again in Canada as vital parts of planning, maintaining, operating infrastructure that is climate resilient. Land use planning, of course, in terms of situating infrastructure and development in places that are appropriate both for the current and potential future climate, given how climate risks will change, is vital as well. So all of those that we have heard from stakeholders across the country, particularly in the municipal sector, are areas where they need supports, they need standardized approaches, and they need capacity, certainly, especially at the small and medium-sized municipality level.
Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. When you look at the funds that we have available now, the Canada Community Building Fund, which is a form of gas tax fund, the Green Building Fund, Disaster Mitigation Fund, even through the Ports Modernization Review, some expected funding to come through that review. And you're correct in mentioning that. The bottom line is that when it comes to climate change and it comes to the cost of climate change, what we're trying to do, not only through those funds, but also through the carbon tax, carbon pricing, is actually contribute a lot of the dollars that we collect, in this case from the polluters, and repurpose that money back to the municipalities. Because the wildfires and the 100-year storms that are now 5-year storms cost money. And that lands, and quite frankly, defaults onto the property taxpayer and their water bills. So by giving through those funds at all levels of government, particularly here at the federal level of government, the ones I just mentioned, as well as the carbon pricing, carbon tax money going back to residents individual, not a percent, and of course 10% going back to municipalities, mitigates that impact it has on otherwise the property taxpayers and the water bills. But you raise a good point about debentures. And would you agree that if we had a sustainable fund, whether it's through the FCM or other mechanisms, that municipalities can then take full advantage of debenturing a lot of that infrastructure work over the period of time, paying it down, but using the funds that may be available at all levels of government to pay down that debenture so that their operating budgets aren't impacted upon through their capital planning and capital budgets based on the money that are actually sustainably funding that operating budget, once again mitigating the default to property taxpayers and water bills.
Thank you again for the question, and through you, Mr. Chair. I can't comment on the specific design and use of debentures, not having studied that specifically at the Institute, but certainly, again, the existing funding mechanisms and capital raising mechanisms available to municipalities, we've heard over and over again, are not adequate for their needs in terms of the scale of funding and the timeframes over which they need to achieve that funding to be able to adapt their infrastructure to the scale as required.
Thank you, Mr. Ness. I appreciate the answers. To that same question, Mr. Veliquette, Mayor Veliquette, you commented a bit on the sustainable funding needed to actually satisfy the capital and then therefore the operational budgets that are being impacted by capital. Can you speak on the debenturing and, of course, the ability that you would have, in fact, if that money, that sustainable money, was actually made available to you?
Well, of course. Thank you, sir. Well, en fait, je vais me fier.
I speak better French than English, so I'll speak through the interpreter. There was talk about the best way for municipalities to have a plan. Like we have an intervention framework, and I think that we in the municipalities really are best placed to understand what's happening on the ground and to react. So in terms of funding, we want it to be sustainable and predictable, and then we can act in terms of prevention before weather events happen. So I think that really is the key. Having some sort of a sustainable fund, a reliable, stable fund that would allow us to focus on prevention. Thank you. That would reduce costs. Yes, thank you, Mr. Veliquette.
Mr. Badaway, prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelot.
Next, we have Mr. Barcelot Duval. 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. This is a very busy meeting, and I hope that we will have enough time to hear from everyone. I'll start with the mayor of Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Ms. Bouchard. Now, like many other cities in Quebec, Saint-Jean has to update its sewer infrastructure from time to time to make sure that different canals are separated in terms of water treatment. You sort of mentioned 2018 in your speech earlier, but could you tell me, what does that mean for a city like yours? And how is that linked to the question of climate change? Well, it has a major impact, because this issue of climate change means that our aging infrastructure can't process water the way it's supposed to. So that leads to a very significant financial cost. Of course, we have many other things to do than keeping all the pipes separate. We also have to provide many other services to citizens. Currently, the biggest difficulty is that, like every other municipality in Quebec, we're dealing with a housing crisis. We have a very low vacancy rate, and so we need to focus on densification of housing. And some of our aging infrastructure is really preventing us from doing that. So it's a safety issue. So if I've understood correctly, the standards that you need to meet for the future are also a problem in terms of densification, because if your sewer system already isn't up to standard, then it's hard to densify and get more people using the same network, which is already at capacity, right? Yes, that's exactly right. Another question for you. Of course, you can get funding to help you on these issues. To what degree would you say that the current funding that exists is doing its job, is sufficient? So the current level of funding is not sufficient at all. That's why we've been making more and more applications to the government of Quebec and to the federal government as well. Thank you. That answered my question, even if my question wasn't perfectly clear. Earlier, you talked about flooding, and of course, your city is on the river. It's also very close to Lake Champlain. We've also heard from mayors from Saint-Ours and other municipalities in the area who talked about the communication difficulties. Sometimes decisions are made by the federal government about high water levels. They have dams and locks that allow them to manage the water level. And I'm wondering, on your end, how did communication with the federal government happen? Was it satisfactory? Yes, so we actually have a tripartite committee to deal with public safety. Of course, that's provincial jurisdiction, but we also have partners in Vermont and in the federal government. And so we've been working together on that since 2011. And so that was following the flooding that you set that up and were then able to get better information about how water levels are managed. Is that correct? Yes. Unfortunately, there's always an event or a natural disaster that leads us to make changes. We always think that we'll be ready for these things, but we never are. As I said earlier, it's now not a question of if, but when. Thank you. Mr. Valiquette, earlier you were talking about shoreline erosion and the issue of rising sea levels, I believe you said, which have an impact on your infrastructure. Would you say that the federal funding that you need exists to help you deal with those consequences? And are there any improvements that could be made on the federal end? Well, yes. I mean, there's always room for improvement when it comes to funding programs. You could draw a parallel with the first question that was asked at the beginning. The idea is to give money at the beginning, at the outset. We're always forced to react when there's a storm or an event. So infrastructure funding programs from the federal government do exist, but given that we often want to focus on protection and prevention, we're actually often forced to react to violent storms or extreme shoreline erosion. So we actually end up dealing with it from a public security and after the fact. If we had a fund that would help. Municipalities already have a lot of work to do in terms of prevention and preventing coastal submersion and erosion. But federal funds and tools could really be aligned with the provincial programs and tools so that we could have easier access for the municipalities. I think that is an issue. Thank you very much, Mr. Veliquette. And Mr. Barceau-Duval.
Hello, Ms. Cirillo. The floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to direct my first questions to Mayor Bousses. Is it? I hope I pronounced that properly. You really brought this really down to the people level. You really talked about how it impacted people on the ground when an extreme event happens like that. And two of the things you spoke of was like a more robust communications piece, ability, and also protection of utilities. So I know in my riding of Port Moody Coquitlam, we have a Coquitlam Amateur Radio Emergencies Safety Society, and we know that we've leaned on that amateur radio society before an emergency. So I wanted to understand from you, Mayor, how these emergencies impact people on the ground, just thinking of it, more locally, and what can the federal government do to support better communications, or at least that Plan B, and also on utilities Plan B.
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for the question. Well, I think amateur radio is a great solution for those who know how to use it. But of course, most people don't. So we have communication between the fire and civil safety services over the waves, but our biggest problem is actually reaching citizens, and that's really the key. We want to make sure. Our first role is always to protect citizens. So how do we know if they've left their homes, if they're still in their homes, if they need something? We need to be able to reach them. Back in 1998, in the ice storm, a former mayor at the time actually gave me a list of people to call out of the phone book. We don't have a phone book today, so we don't even know how to reach out to people. So when social networks are working well, people can send messages on Facebook and everything else. Well, that's great. But when the networks are down, it's really hard to reach people individually. So that's why we start going door to door. Now, what can be done? Every telecommunications tower is under federal jurisdiction. So the federal government needs to make sure that those towers are able to withstand natural disasters. We had flooding in 2018, 19, 23. There was a windstorm in 2016. There was a train derailment. All of those events led to loss of power for part of our area. But when telecommunications towers fall down, that really is a big problem. So we need to find a solution. Is there better technology? Maybe. But I think from the federal end, I think you need to make sure that telecommunications towers have batteries that can last X number of hours. And, that is the case for many of them now. But sometimes after 2 to 3 hours, the battery might run down, and then you need to send someone to go replace them or recharge them. But at the very least, we need to have some sort of group dealing with that. And, of course, then you need electricity for them to be able to recharge the batteries. So that's the type of thing that we're dealing with. But really, I think that communication is key in any emergency situation. I've been working at the municipal level for 15 years, and every time we have an event like this, the biggest danger is always communication. So we need to make sure that we have a stronger system, that our telecommunications towers are more robust, and also we need to make sure that cell phone networks across the country are robust as well.
That information, and I was living in Ile Bizarre on the first ice storm, so close by you. I wanted to just, my last 2 minutes to Mr. Nielsen at TransLink. My riding is Port Moody Coquitlam, so obviously very familiar with TransLink and the new infrastructure that came into my community over the last 5 years. I wanted to talk about this reliable funding, this permanent reliable funding that we know the government has promised, but not until 2026. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing, Mr. Nielsen, how important it is to have that funding advanced and to have it right away.
Thank you for the question, and through the chair, I think there's two aspects of funding, and kind of building on Mr. Ness's comments, is that we actually need sort of two streams. One is to learn to understand more about where our risks and our vulnerabilities are. We're currently conducting risk and hazard and vulnerability studies. So that is just to be able to expand our knowledge. And once we know what our risks and vulnerabilities are, then we can actually define what kind of capital changes, or whether we retreat or advance or modify or upgrade infrastructure. So we need that larger pot as well. The first few years, we're learning more about where our risks and vulnerabilities lie, where we need that consistent funding to do those studies. That's really important. But the larger capital will come later. I think the Permanent Transit Fund should hopefully provide even both, right? But in the interim, we need to get started, and we need to understand what our current risk profile is. We've done some very high level work. We generally know where our risks and vulnerabilities lie, but now we need to go to the next level of detail. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zerillo. Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to all witnesses as well for your time and expertise. Mr. Chair, I gave notice of motion on Thursday last week with regard to the supplemental estimates and the ministers appearing, and so I'd like to move that motion for consideration. I know that's been distributed by the clerk to all members.
Do we have unanimous consent to have the ministers appear for supplemental estimates? Seeing no objection, motion carries.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues. First question to Mr. Lee. In your experience working with home buyers, what are the incentives? Because you mentioned a number of different incentives from the federal, provincial, and things that can be done for home builders from the municipal level. But what are the incentives that home buyers would most value in terms of taking action in that investment, a huge investment that they're going to make in a home, and making that investment one that's a more sustainable home?
Apologies, Mr. Lee. I believe you're on mute once again, sir.
Thank you for the question. I believe the biggest problem that the buyers have are usually the deposit. Even though we try to make the deposits as little as possible, I think what is most important right now for us is to lower the so-called eco homes as low as possible. And with support from the different levels of the government, we can definitely do that. And one most gratifying development is what I call, the so-called the involvement of the institutional money. And I believe that there are a lot of pension funds, institutional private equities are now looking at the kind of energy assets we are building, not only in individual homes, but also in condominiums. They are willing to come forward with, say, hey, Mr. Lee, I want to support your geothermal initiative. I can provide all the funding you need for the geothermal infrastructure. And what you need to do is, when you sell the condos, like, in Windsor, we will sign up a contract with the condo owners, so that instead of you paying all the money upfront, I can ask the condo buyers to give me a service charge, like $100 per month, so that in the next 25 years they don't have to pay the utility. Instead, they pay me, the geothermal contractors, for the free use of the energies in the next 25 years. And this will help us to lower the selling price, the sales price. And this is a great help in making the buyers know that, we are getting a home upfront at a comparable price with the conventional builders. And then at the same time, they're only going to pay a limited amount of energy service fee over the next 25 years. And this is a big help. I can see that it's a very promising development.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I'd like to also ask a question of Mr. Ness. You talked about proactive investment in infrastructure adaptation and agreed that makes sense. Are you aware of, is there a list that your organization has or exists at other organizations or levels of government that, prioritizes and assesses the risk? And, where do we go to in terms of what are the top tier priorities? What's the next tranche? Where are the areas of risk, et cetera?
Thank you for the question, and through you, Mr. Chair. There is no sort of one-stop shop for that kind of information. There are at different levels information that can be used for that purpose. The National Adaptation Strategy, sort of at the very highest level, identifies some top-level priorities for the country. Many provinces and territories have risk and vulnerability assessments where they have identified their top priorities, including their top infrastructure priorities, and many municipalities have done the same as well. The challenge is still that many jurisdictions have not completed those assessments to know where their infrastructure risks are greatest and where investment might best be spent. And many of them don't have the capacity. Again, small and medium-sized municipalities specifically often lack the staff capacity and the ability to sort of even hire the expertise to be able to do those kinds of assessments. So supports in terms of capacity, in terms of standardized approaches for doing that kind of work are essential to being able, as you say, to use that funding effectively.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ness, and thank you, Mr. Muse. Next, we have Mr. Chahal. Mr. Chahal, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Ness, I'm going to start with you and from your presentation, and I'm going to focus on zoning and building codes, and you made comments and recommendations about transparency as well and risk and loss and how that transparency is important for communities and individuals. And my constituency was hit with a massive hailstorm, $1.5 billion up to $1.5 billion of damage, 35,000 homes damaged. And one area we identified was the roofs. If we had better and more resilient roofs, we could have prevented those homes from being damaged and 35,000 homes potentially in insurance claims avoided. Now, when it comes to building codes, municipalities have a role, our provincial governments have a role. We had an extensive dialogue on this issue. The City of Calgary came forward with a resilient roofing program, which was very successful and actually nationally recognized. And so when you're in Calgary, you're in Hailstorm Alley, these storms come, they're ferocious, they do a lot of damage. Wouldn't it make sense to mandate maybe resilient roofs and provide incentives for homeowners to do so?
Thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. Building codes and infrastructure codes and standards that dictate the way in which infrastructure and buildings should be constructed are an essential part of building an adapted country with resilient infrastructure. The challenge is updating frequently, and from what we've heard through our research is that the pace of those updates, the research at the national level, the trickle down, and the actual implementation in provincial codes, and then the implementation and enforcement of those provincial building codes and standards is a long process, and one that's going to need to be accelerated if our building approaches are going to be made resilient in the very limited amount of time we have to catch up to climate change.
And I'm focusing on resilient roofs because that was an impact in my constituency. Fort Collins, Colorado mandated resilient roofs. We've also seen from the other day, the IBC talked about providing incentives and also opportunities for homeowners to have those resiliency built in so they could have lower insurance cost. Do you think we need to have a conversation and look at further incentives nationally that pushes our provincial counterparts on building codes to ensure that we have, where if you're in, let's say, Hailstorm Alley like in Alberta and southern Alberta, that you have resilient roofing programs?
Thank you for the question. And again, through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, there's to your first point, there's the need for both sort of the carrot and the stick side of the equation, both the regulation of the way things are built, but also incentives for builders and homeowners to apply measures that make them more resilient through and that encourage them through things like insurance savings. And again, I'll repeat that the building codes, whether it be resilient roofs or other aspects of design that need to be that need to accommodate climate change and more harsh and extreme weather, are a vital part of the solution, but aren't happening fast enough and need to be accelerated. And that will require intergovernmental cooperation.
Mr. Lee, I'm going to go to you, and thank you for joining us today and talking about your community. And as it's a net zero community of attainable eco homes, reading an article is what they stated and what you talked about today. Can you tell us a little bit about your sustainability and your community development? Mr. Ness talked about roads earlier, whether it's roads, stormwater, how your community development promotes sustainability, and the net zero component is also a part of your entire community development. You've done a great job of talking about the homes specifically. I'm curious to know more about the entire community.
20 seconds, please.
Okay. Right now, I think it is a challenge for us. Basically, I don't think the municipality is ready for this kind of development, and the buyers are not ready. But I believe that it is a good challenge for us to put out the homes at a price that the buyers can afford, which, as I said, very important. And I believe once we have done a showcase, and then other builders will follow, and the municipality will give us the necessary support if they see that it works for the community.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee, and thank you, Mr. Chahal. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Next, we have Mr. Barcelou-Duval. You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll ask a question to Mr. Valiquette again. Now, this is the Transport Committee and Infrastructure and Communities. As the transport critic for the bloc, I often receive complaints from people from the Magdalen Islands saying that flights are very irregular and it's difficult to get constant service there. And often it seems that their airlines blame the weather. Now, there have been a lot of storms, ice storms and that type of thing, but we're seeing them more and more frequently, and they are affecting the Magdalen Islands. You said yourself that hurricanes are becoming more frequent. So, given all of that, the runway at the Magdalen Islands Airport is actually one of the shortest in Quebec, or the shortest in Quebec. Do you think that has anything to do with those problems? Having regular, reliable airline service? And do you think that that problem will grow with climate change? Yeah, I'm sure that will be the case. In the past, we would often have pretty cold winters, and we were able to adapt to those conditions. But now we have winters where they get warmer. We get often up towards zero, so you have rain, freezing rain in particular, and that will affect transport infrastructure very severely. So it's true that the runway and airport infrastructure, which belongs to Transport Canada, does need to be updated, and the runway should be lengthened. As I said in my opening remarks, that's also true of the port infrastructure. I was asked earlier about what kind of funding we would need to protect that infrastructure from climate change. And I mean, yes, a dedicated funding to infrastructure for municipalities would be useful, but first and foremost, I think the federal government needs to adapt its own infrastructure on the Magdalen Islands and take on the financial responsibility that comes with that. I think you had given a specific example, which is the commercial wharf at Cap aux Meules. And all of the material that you need on the island goes through that wharf, including the material that is used to update the coast and the shoreline. Yes, so Cap aux Meules, that port is used very intensively. There are barges that come and unload stones and other material that can be used to reinforce the shoreline. And we've invested, a lot in that. And the wharf is aging and is really being impacted by climate change, and it's now too old to be able to bring in some of that material that we need. So you can see the paradox there. Thank you very much, Mr. Valiquette, and thank you, Mr. Barcelot-Duval.
Next, we have Ms. Zerillo. Ms. Zerillo, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. And my questions are going to be for Mr. Ness, actually, and it'll sure take up the full 2.5 minutes. So, Mr. Ness, I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and then you can just answer them in the order in which you prefer. So I wanted to revisit again the communication and the utilities. And my question is, what can the federal government do to protect the communication systems and the utilities that Canadians rely on every day, but definitely during natural disasters? And then the second question just is, in your 20 years, can you share some of the government roadblocks that you have faced in regards to our lack of preparedness for extreme weather events and resilient infrastructure?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly the government has a role, the federal government has a role to play in ensuring the resilience of our telecommunications systems. We haven't researched the specific mechanisms that are available to do so, but certainly in terms of its role in regulating those systems and the providers of those systems, ensuring that they are maintaining and constructing infrastructure that is designed to face the future climate. With respect to the second question, there are always challenges in dealing with a sort of a large, complex democracy in moving major issues like adaptation forward. But certainly, adaptation has taken a second place to mitigation, which is obviously still important. Reducing our greenhouse gas emissions is the number one form of adaptation we can take. However, it has taken most of the air in the room, and there hasn't been as much attention to adaptation. As well, the benefits of adaptation are realized over quite a long term, certainly well beyond sort of individual electoral cycles in many cases. So it's difficult often with more pressing priorities to justify expenditures that may not pay off and many won't ever pay off in very dramatic and showy ways decades down the line.
I still have a very quick 30 seconds here, so I'm going to ask Mayor Valiquette, if I could, just wanted to know if there is good visibility into the selection process for some of these climate adaptation funds. Let's say, for example, the Disaster Mitigation Fund from the federal government. Is there good visibility into who's getting chosen and why?
Well, I believe so. It's hard for me to say in all the province or in all the country, but in Magdalen Islands we did extensive works over the 10 last years to characterize and target specific spots and areas where they're most vulnerable to climate change. But we also need the flexibility to change that prioritization over a sudden and unexpected climate event.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Valiquette.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Zerillo. Next, we have Ms. Vecchio. Ms. Vecchio, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
And thank you very much. It's great to be here on this important committee today. And Mr. Lee, I'm going to start with you. I'm very fortunate because I live near the University of Western Ontario, or Western University. And within our own riding, we have people from the Canadian Home Builders and Ontario Home Builders that are doing a lot of work when it comes to research and development. And I'm asking, you've talked a lot about making sure that these homes are net zero. Have you also taken into consideration wind resistance, ensuring that those nails or screws are the 6-inch screws? What types of things have you done when it comes to mitigation for wind?
Basically, in our case, we have used very resilient roof. You use metal roof because it's easy for the solar panel installer to put it there. And as we are using a little bit more advanced kind of metal roof, like the standing seamless, slab knot kind of mechanism. So we have a very, very strong roof protection for the solar panel as well as for the roof. So the metal roof, I think for one of the members have just suggested, if there's a hailstorm, a metal roof is a very good, protection, foolproof protection mechanism.
Perfect.
To protect the property.
Thanks so much, and I absolutely agree on that. But have you also taken into consideration when you're talking about ensuring that those faucets, everything is put on, have you increased what you're using when it comes to products to ensure that they have reached that research and development level to make sure that wind, so yeah, the steel roof's there, but ensuring that the roof doesn't come off, what are you using to ensure that it is attached properly?
Basically, when it comes to very technical stuff, to be honest, I don't know. But usually we have got an architect who have come up. We have assigned an architect in Windsor to do all this design in terms of their cover, architectural, mechanical, and even structural.
Perfect.
So I count on them to do.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm just really fortunate because I am surrounded by just some incredible home builders who are doing a lot of research. So I may just have a little bit of extra knowledge from them taking me on the sites all the time. I also want to ask you, you were talking about charging the cars. And I know one of the greatest challenges that we're hearing from many home builders is that, yes, people want one car charger, but they actually want two. But what they're finding out is there's not enough power. Sometimes if they're at the end of that road, there's not going to be enough power for them. Have you come across any of those challenges? And if so, how have you addressed them?
So far, we are pretty lucky in that, in our garage, it's a 2-car garage, basically. And then I think we have sourced a supplier that can do a EV charger, level 2 EV charger, at very modest price, $3,000, that's all. And then I can install it, as part of the building cost, and 2 cars, maybe one unit from the owner and the one from the ADU additional dwelling unit. They share the chargers at the same time, and the cost is really modest.
Mr. Lee, I guess one of the challenges I've had is we've heard that there's not enough energy though to do this. You've got all the testing and all of that, so there will be enough energy for 2 cars per household that are electrically charged.
Yes, basically, as you know, that we have a geothermal system. Basically, all the heating and cooling power demand are handled by the geothermal. And what we need to do is we have installed 13 kilowatt of solar PV panels on the rooftop. And it will take care basically all the rest of the power for lighting, for cooking, your video game and TV and so on.
Perfect.
So it's also good enough to provide the solar and the PV chargers.
Thank you so much. You're doing incredible work. I just want to switch it over to the Climate Institute and speak with Ryan there for a moment. I see some incredible flood mapping that's being done, and I know I'm very fortunate to live on Lake Erie. We have 4 great ports, that I'm really, really proud of. But one of the biggest challenges we look at is when people are building on floodplains. What do you see across Canada when it comes to the flood mapping, and are we ensuring that all of our municipalities and conservation authorities do have that access to doing that?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. The state of flood mapping across Canada is not an ideal one. As I mentioned earlier, probably half of households that are at high risk of flooding in Canada are not actually on a flood map anywhere, so have no way of knowing about their risk. Municipalities are often left to develop that information on their own when development comes up, and there are sort of time pressures associated and political pressures associated with moving that development forward, and often the mapping can't get done fast enough. Ontario is lucky to have the institution of the conservation authorities, which do a lot of that work. Other provinces don't have that, and even in Ontario, conservation authorities often lack the resources to be able to keep mapping up to date. Mapping across the country is generally obsolete. The average age of flood mapping in the country is sort of over 20 years, and essentially 0% of flood mapping reflects the changing risk of flooding from climate change. It only reflects historic risk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ness, and thank you, Ms. Vecchio. Je vais prendre le prochain tour de questions.
I'm going to take the next round of questions, and my questions will be for Mr. Boussez. I want to thank you sincerely for being here today, not only as the chair of our committee, but also as the member of Vaudreuil-Soulanges. So thank you for sharing your experience from that area with the committee. Mr. Boussez, could you tell us any other examples, other than the ice storm, that might illustrate some of the issues that municipalities are facing, particularly in the context of climate change? And are we ready to confront those challenges? Well, I mentioned a few briefly earlier. Our region is at a high risk of flooding and has been since the flooding in 2018 and 2019. This year it's on a smaller scale, but there were still 135 homes affected that may have to be demolished. In any case, flooding is one thing. Snowstorms, like we saw on December 24th, are another example that totally paralyzed some sectors. So these are increasingly violent weather phenomenon, and they're not always predictable. Sometimes there have been just very small storms destroying wooded areas. Near my house, there was a bit of a vortex coming in 2016 that damaged the skating rink. So events like that are really unpredictable are going to happen more and more often. Global warming is one thing, but we've also seen extremely cold weather followed 2 days later by extremely unseasonably warm weather. So we see a lot of things like that now. Are we ready? The answer is no. We're never really sufficiently prepared. Are we learning from our mistakes? Yes, we learned about the ice storm after 98, but during the last ice storm, in the first few hours, there were still only 8 out of 23 municipalities that were actually ready, which is surprising. And there are municipalities that can contain, 1,500 or 2,000 people, but they don't have proper generators. They don't have proper electricity to host people there. So are we ready? No. The member was asking me earlier about amateur radio networks. Well, as long as our telecommunications network isn't more robust, and as long as we don't have communication services that are actually adapted to this type of weather event, then we may have to fall back on amateur radio, but that's not going to be able to reach everyone. And it's only good for communicating between a few people. So certainly we're never sufficiently ready for everything. And that's just not in Vaudreuil-Soulanges. That's all across Canada. I am wondering, do you think it's a lack of planning? Is it a lack of awareness about, federal funding that might exist to help? Or is it that the criteria of the existing funds mean that the municipalities actually can't get access to it? What exactly is the problem? Well, you've raised a number of points. One, people don't always have the right information. There are so many different programs. Often, it's not that the money isn't available. It's how do you find those programs? If there was a sort of one-stop shop, that would certainly make things easier. If there was one person who could answer and say, okay, look, we can slot you into this or that box, that would be helpful. Whereas we have to sort of look for each program ourselves. There's also a misalignment between the provincial and federal programs. Often some funding has to go through the provinces before it can get to the municipalities. That doesn't make any sense, and that needs to be dealt with urgently. But I think that there are, I mean, I don't know if there's a lack of understanding, but there might actually be some misinformation out there about the programs that are available to municipalities. So I think there's a lot of work to do to be able to help the municipalities and guide them. And when it comes to adapting to climate change, when you see communities that have been affected by flooding, I mean, what do? Do we demolish half the city because it was affected by flooding, or do we try to build a dike? You know, sometimes that does help, but then sometimes the Department of the Environment prevents people from building the dike. So if you've got a school with 5,000 people, you know, sometimes we need a bit more flexibility to be able to do some of those things if we really want to be able to adapt to climate change. You know, I think that a dike is necessary in that type of case. Thank you very much.
Mr. Morrison, the floor is yours. What we'll do for the last round, colleagues, if it's okay with you, we have 12 minutes left, so we'll give all parties 3 minutes. I'll turn the floor over to you, Mr. Morrison.
Thank you, Chair. And my first question is going to be for Mr. Ness. And I was really happy to hear you talking about proactive investment. I mean, we can go to the Sumas floods where $1 billion damage when the dikes didn't survive, and that was predicted. Now, I have a unique problem in my riding as well, the Columbia River Basin, which supports over 600 hydroelectric dams. Part of the dam system goes down into the United States, comes back up into Canada. Where it comes back up into Canada is a Kootenay River system, and the Kootenay River Kootenay River dikes are failing, and we know that, we're predicting it. Yet it's really hard to get the federal government to look at proactive investment. We always are reacting, and it costs us significantly more money. I'm just wondering if you can just give me an example of how we can stress the importance of proactive investment over reactive.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, I think those kinds of examples, that the dikes for flood protection that have been so much the subject of conversation lately, when they are allowed to degrade, when they're not maintained to the level of service, to the level of protection that they've been were originally designed to provide. You know, we see the consequences of them not doing their job during a major flood event. The cost of upgrading and maintaining those dikes would almost certainly have been a fraction of the cost of the damage that resulted. And we see this over and over again in all kinds of disasters. We could have foreseen where it would have been impacted, as the Insurance Bureau of Canada mentioned in earlier testimony. Most of the flood risk in this country is concentrated in sort of the top few percent of homes that are at flood risk. So, you know, a relatively small investment to protect or perhaps relocate those homes would deliver major benefits in terms of reducing the flood damage that those homeowners and then the Canadian economy as a whole have to bear.
Thanks very much. And my last question is for Mr. Nielsen, TransLink. And I am a TransLink user whenever I'm in Vancouver, so you have a very good system there. But the problem to me, being from rural British Columbia, rural Canada, is we're certainly putting a lot of investments in urban areas, but our rural communities have opportunities as well. For example, we have a fairly good train system, and so we can actually go to electric trains, but it's really hard to get noticed, I guess, when we're focusing so much on urban. So I'm wondering, being from TransLink, Lower Mainland, I understand, how can we make our government, say federal, more aware of the needs in the rural communities as well, where we have distance challenges and weather challenges and that? Thank you.
Excellent question. So through the chair, I think the Lower Mainland, inclusive of the entire Fraser Valley, needs to be looked at as a system, as a watershed, right? If we take a watershed view, what happened in terms of our flooding several years ago, could have happened right in the hearts of our urban populations as well. So the importance of the lower mainland flood strategy across the entire system, what we do in one part of that overall watershed for diking or improving or taking back orphan dikes or making them seismic resilience is really, really important.
Thank you, Mr.
It can't just be
Nielsen.
one body doing that. So I think the federal government has a role in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Nielsen, and thank you, Mr. Morrison. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Try to do the best we can in 3 minutes. Mr. Neese, in Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, the federal government sets a number of targets for improving understanding of the risk that climate change poses to infrastructure. And, for example, by 2025, 60% of Canadians are aware of the disaster risk facing their household as a result of climate change. By 2028, at least 200 out of 250 targeted high-risk areas identified as priorities in collaboration with the provinces and territories are covered by new flood hazard maps produced in accordance with scientific guidance and made available to Canadians. And by 2025, 50% of Canadians have taken measures to respond to climate change risk facing their households. So given these targets, what is Canadians' current level of understanding of the disaster risk their household faces because of climate change? And what steps can Canadians take to address the climate change-related risk facing their individual households?
Mr. Chair, just confirming that question is for me.
Yes, it is, Mr. Ness.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Through the chair, the state of understanding of Canadians of climate risk is actually very poor. There have been interesting studies done that have shown that fractions, 10% or less even perhaps, of Canadians who live in flood risk zones are actually aware that they are at risk. So there is not only a gap in climate risk information in this country, but even where it exists, Canadians aren't accessing it to better understand that they are in fact at risk. To the second question, in terms of what Canadians can do, certainly there are some steps that Canadians can do to make their homes more resilient, for example, and to upgrade their homes. And there are some government programs at various levels that can help them do that. I would also, though, submit that Canadians should look to their elected officials and to their public servants to be taking the right steps in terms of the big things that need to be done at a collective scale to protect them from risk, whether it's building flood risk protection infrastructure, moving neighborhoods out of harm's way, or the like.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers, and thank you very much, Mr. Ness. Next, prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Next, Mr. Barcelou-Duval. You have the floor for 3 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Boussez, earlier you said that really the key thing when you have one of these exceptional weather events, is communication. And it's becoming harder and harder to get into contact with people because we don't have people's individual cell phone numbers. Do you think that telephone books or some sort of directory like that should be made available? Should there be some sort of official list that municipalities and public authorities and MPs' offices, for example, could have access to? Because, of course, we want to be able to get in touch with them, but, you know, are you okay? Do you need anything? We want to be able to send those messages. What do you think? That would help us a lot. You know, back when there were telephone books, of course, there were still some people who weren't listed because there were some people who had private numbers. But would it help? Yes. But is there any kind of application to reach out to people? Yes, some exist. I won't give the names, but there are applications where we ask citizens to register, provide their information. That's one thing. And then when it comes to sending out messages, if there's no telecommunications tower that's functional, well, then you can't get the message out. So, yes, it's an advantage to have a list of information from our citizens. So that's why anytime we have someone join the community, we do try to take their information. Of course, they're not obliged to give it to us, but we do try to take it. So again, landlines no longer exist, and it's hard to get those numbers. And the big problem is really the robustness of the telecommunications tower. We landed on the moon in 1969, but we still can't have reliable cell service. It doesn't make sense. So this is where the investments need to be made. It's federal infrastructure, and we need to force them to infrastructure in them. It doesn't make sense that we went to the moon when we had like an old 386 computer, and now it's 2023, and we're not able to communicate with people. I'm an hour and a half away from here, and in that time, in the time that I came here, I lost network coverage about 3 times. I acknowledge that it's a big country, but it doesn't make sense that we can't have that coverage. And we weren't even talking about really extreme wind when the network coverage wasn't there. So imagine if you lose 1 or 2 or 3 telecommunications towers. Thank you.
If the committee's in agreement, before I turn the floor over to the final line of questioning by Mr. Rillo, I'd like to request officially to the telecommunications companies that they submit a written response to the committee with regards to why, for the period of 5 to 6 days, millions of Quebecers were without cell service. And it's not to lay blame, it's fully to understand what infrastructure challenges are we facing right now that in 2023 we're still experiencing this and causing elected officials to experience significant challenges when we're trying to serve our population during crisis. Is the committee in agreement? Okay. With that, we'll turn the floor over to Ms. Cirillo for the final line of questioning. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start by just asking Mr. Ness again just to revisit one of the reports that was the Due North report, just quoting the Due North report that says transformative adaptation is needed to address the northern infrastructure gap and worsening climate impacts. And it goes on to talk about a fundamentally rethinking how infrastructure is built in the north for northerners. And I wonder, Mr. Ness, if you have some examples for us of how it's different, what the gaps are, and what needs to be done quickly up in northern communities.
Thank you for the question, and through the chair, that particular recommendation in the Due North report was recognizing that much of the infrastructure that exists in the north right now will not be viable in the future. Much of it is built on thermofrost, which will thaw permanently, will be gone, and will leave sort of unsuitable, unstable soil beneath it, and infrastructure in many ways will have to be a do-over. So it is an opportunity to rethink the infrastructure that Northerners need. Much of their existing infrastructure was not designed with them in mind or with their input. So this is a chance to design their communities in a way and in places that make sense for them and that are also resilient to the long-term impacts of climate change, whether that be new ways of getting around the north that don't rely on winter roads, which again will not be viable in much of the north before too much longer, whether it's new ways of constructing buildings, and new ways of air transport even that are being discussed in the north.
Thank you. And then thank you for that. And I'm just going to ask the mayor of Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu just about some shared jurisdiction when it comes to water with our neighbors in the south. I know in the Fraser Valley, a portion of that flooding that happened in the Fraser Valley for the atmospheric rivers came up from waterways in the south in the United States, and there is some conversations now about shared jurisdiction on water. So I note that you also are on a very large body of water, and I wonder if there's shared jurisdiction conversations that you've had, and if you have any concerns about flooding that could come from the south.
Absolument. Actuellement.
Absolutely. So currently we're in contact with Vermont because we share, we're both on Lake Champlain. And on the steering committee, we do have people from Vermont.
And can you hear me? Is there a federal representative on, you talked about a steering committee. Is there a Canadian federal representative on that steering committee?
C'est une information.
I don't have that information right now. I believe that probably yes, but I can't confirm.
Merci beaucoup, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Mayor.
Ms. Cirillo, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of our witnesses for appearing before committee today and contributing to this very important study. With that, this meeting is adjourned.